I started as Biodiversity Officer last year, so I'm in the role just over a year now. The Biodiversity Officer program is rolled out by the Heritage Council, so it's a national program. So there's now, I think we have a complete suite of biodiversity officers there's one in every local authority, at least one in every local authority in Ireland. And some local authorities have more than one, which is great. So the role is really around implementation of the biodiversity action plans. There's elements of advice, training, community engagement, and then supporting research and surveys that are required within the county. The most rewarding part for me, I suppose I came into the role on the back of the research I was doing for my own PhD, and that revolves around communities and environmental stewardship. So I've done a lot of work with different groups around Kerry, particularly around South Kerry, around different issues of kind of protecting the environment or working to have better access to it, to address issues like invasive species. And so for me, that part of working with the communities and seeing the engagement at that level and seeing the positive actions that come of it. Throughout Kerry, we have a number of really active and really successful community groups that are working on key issues in their local environments. I suppose I find that really inspiring in a way, in that they've taken the initiative themselves, they're driving forward with positive ideas, they're able to navigate. There's quite a complex environmental sector that they have to navigate through, and that kind of involves issues around funding, around permissions, or around working through different legislations or different policies that we have at the moment. So it's not an easy thing sometimes for communities to achieve. So it's really great to see them able to do it and having the capacity to do it. And I suppose my greatest success, I suppose, is that, or my greatest joy from my work is that I get to assist in that process for the groups of getting them into a stage where they're able to successfully implement the things they want to do within their communities that are positive for the environment. Yes, loads. So I suppose the first one that always springs to mind when you talk about Kerry is the Maharees Conservation Association. So they're based up in the Maharees, which is just around Tralee Bay. They started working on a sand dune conservation project. There's huge issues there with deterioration of the sand dunes. And this was creating issues with sand blowing over the road, flooding issues, lots of different problems, and obviously degradation of the habitat that was there in the sand dune. And so they came together as a community group, and they implemented like a community warden initiative where they would ask people to stop parking on the dunes, they would ask people to stop wild camping. And initially they were met with a lot of resistance because these were actions that people had been carrying out for, a number of years, and we weren't really aware of the damage that was happening. And so when the community really stood up and said, no, we're not going to allow these to happen any longer, it was kind of almost a 180 on the behaviours that have been happening previously. But they've had incredible success in restoration of the sand dunes. They have regular marm grass planting. They put out chestnut fencing every year to help with the restoration project. And they've done a huge amount of community engagement and awareness. They've really started to tell the stories of the animals and the plants that you find in those sand dune habitats, and that's really engaged the rest of the community. So it's kind of one of those projects where you go to Maharees and pretty much everyone there knows about the group. They're probably part of it or they've gone to one of the events. So it's really had a community-wide impact, which is fantastic. And they've won awards all over the country. They've won just recently, I think they won a Heritage Award for work on currachs. So they kind of move across that sort of natural and cultural heritage to get towards the aim, which was protecting their area, their sand dunes and their habitats, which is really fantastic. Other groups in Kerry, there's a number of tidy towns groups. I know Ballyduff Tidy Towns have done a huge amount of work on pollinators. Out in Dingle, there's a lot of work. There's a community tree nursery there. Their Sneem Tidy Towns have won the pollinator award for the green flags this year. They've done a huge amount of work with their sensory garden and their wild garden as well. There's a group down in Lorick that are working on rhododendron management. There's a group in Carradaniel that have done some rhododendron mapping. I'm trying to think of any others in case I'm forgetting someone. I'm sure I am, but yeah, there is a lot of examples of groups kind of identifying local issues and then the group kind of forming around this and then pushing forward towards some action or solution. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure before I came across your research that it was something that I had really considered. I suppose I've kind of approached the environmental projects from a very practical aspect, the being and doing of them. But discussing our kind of an environment, our culture, around the concept of a sense of smell is really interesting. We used to do, in a previous role that I was in with Sea Synergy, we used to start off most of our workshops with a mindfulness element where we would ask people to sort of stop for a second and listen to what they could hear, what was the closest sound, the furthest away sound, what could they smell, what did they think it was, why did it smell like that? And so I suppose there is, when you kind of cast your mind to it, you think of, oh, I always wake up in the morning in autumn and I can smell that it's autumn before I go outside and see that it's autumn. You know, we'll have at the end of the summer some of those kind of like chillier, frosty mornings, and you'll think, oh, autumn's coming because you can smell it in the air. And maybe that's the leaves turning in the trees. I don't know what it is, but I feel like there's a particular scent to it. Definitely in terms of like our agriculture, there's silage cutting in the summer. There's the cows in the sheds over winter, so you'd smell the smell of the silage. Like there's a lot of different elements throughout the seasons that you realize that you smell them and you associate with certain points in time. I think that's interesting in how we're linking that. And so now in my role as biodiversity officer, a lot of the other biodiversity officers have come from a more ecology background, and they've been involved in terrestrial mammal conservation projects and bird projects and all kinds of stuff. So they've a huge array of experience behind them. And often they'll be talking about how you identify certain animals by their smells, like their dens might have a certain type of smell or their feces might have a certain type of smell, and that will help you identify what animal it is that you're seeing, like the tracks that you're seeing, what have you. So it's interesting how much it's kind of woven through what we do without really having had a focus on it, if that makes sense. I suppose a lot of the work that I do at the moment is at like it's kind of looking at things from a strategic level, and so you're kind of considering, we might not be specifically looking at one plant, but we're looking at what is the impact of restoration of this peatland in terms of its potential for carbon sequestration, or if we're restoring this sand dune, how does that impact on our climate resilience and that kind of thing. But I think all of those habitats, when you drill down into them, they have certain plants. Like one of my own personal experiences is from the farm at home, and the smell of gorse smells like coconuts. And it's always something that I notice wherever I go. It's always gorse. And if I smell coconuts, I think of the gorse at home, no matter where in the world I am. It's quite an interesting link that constantly brings your mind back to somewhere. But I suppose for me, there's a lot of complexity in learning about the individual species, how they are placed within the food web, and what that means for the sort of ecosystem services that we're concerned about at an ecosystem level. Is this a healthy habitat? Is this not a healthy habitat? And how do we manage that going forwards to sort of give it the best chance at being resilient towards any future changes. Yeah, so the bogs, immediately you think water, so they're a wetland habitat. And the sphagnum mosses that you find in bogs, they can contain or hold they're 20 times their own weight in water. So when we get these heavy rainfalls in our uplands, the bogs have a role there in slowing down the water flow through the habitats, through the ecosystem, down into our streams, our rivers, and our lakes, and how quickly then it flows out towards the sea. This is really important when we're looking at altered habitats and potential for flooding. So the thinking now with water management is the slower it moves through our landscape, the better it is, because you're not going to have these flash floods after heavy rain events. And with the climate projections suggesting that we're going to have heavier rainfall, more intense rain events, the capacity of these habitats to hold on to that water and slow its flow through our landscape, reducing the impact it will have or the negative impact it will have downstream, they're just invaluable. In Kerry particularly, most of our bogs are what we call blanket bogs, so they are upland habitats. So they're kind of the first place that's really going to catch all that rainfall. Outside of that kind of water, they're obviously helping to clean the water as well. There's a great experiment that a friend of mine who works with, she used to work with the McGillicuddy Reeks EIP project, but she's now manager for the Acres Agri-Environmental Scheme, and she showed me a demonstration that they were using with the farmers to show how important the peat was for water quality and for holding onto the water. And they had 3 sort of big tubs set up, and one had what they'd cut out of a really healthy bog, so it was full of plant life. It had a nice thick peat layer, it was great. The next layer had maybe 50% vegetation, the next layer had no vegetation, so it was essentially like a very overgrazed section of peat. And you poured a bottle of water onto them. And in the first one, there was a spout, it came out, and then there was a collecting pot, a clear collecting pot underneath. So you pour your water in the top of the first one with no vegetation cover. So what we would kind of, what they would be scoring as a low value or a degraded sort of peat area. And the water just rushes out brown. The next one, it rushes out, is where you have maybe 50% vegetation. So you've got like an okay habitat, but there's room for improvement. The water gets poured on. It might take a little bit more water than the first one before it starts to flow out, but it still comes out a little brown. You pour the water into the healthy piece of peat that they pulled out, and it took 2 bottles before water started to come out in the first place because it absorbed so much of it. And then the water that came out was clear. So it just shows you like what these habitats are doing for us is incredible. It's a really natural process, but it's really vital for the health of all of our freshwater systems. If that's happening in the uplands, everything coming downwards is impacted by it. And so if we're having a healthy water filtration system up in our uplands, then our streams, our rivers, and our lakes are going to have better water quality as well. And there can be impacts from siltation and there's different kind of impacts for different species. So if you're in a pearl mussel project area or a pearl mussel catchment, so you have pearl mussels, they're usually, the adults are at the bottom of the waterways. They're very susceptible to siltation. So if you get like a heavy rainfall, if your uplands are sort of denuded of vegetation, you're going to have that big flush of silty water coming through, and it's going to really negatively impact your pearl mussel population. So a lot of the conservation work that you're doing up there, it's water quality, it's biodiversity. Like there's such a vast array of species that are dependent on the processes that are happening in our peatlands. Well, for here it would be flooding. Yeah, in Kerry, if we lost our upland peatlands, there's also issues around there, and most of our upland sites are designated as special areas of conservation. And so they're particularly for the peat habitats, but then also for some of the species that occur there. Our peatland habitats are designated because they contain unique species to that habitat. So if we lose our peatlands, we're going to lose a whole suite of species along with them that can't survive in any other habitat. So that's an impact as well, in that you're losing the kind of the culture of these landscapes, that it will change. I think from the perspective of farmers, like there could be concerns there around, like, what do you have if it's not peat? What does that look like? How do they manage it? Like they have really practical concerns around going forward. They're already operating in an area which is considered high nature value, which essentially equals low productivity in terms of its agricultural output. So there's a very fine line of economy that they're working with between the amount of effort it takes to raise animals and make a profit on land like this. And often maybe just break even, maybe not make a profit at all. You know, there's very tight margins in the work that they do. And so changes to the habitat increase that pressure. We're seeing a lot of land abandonment in our upland areas, which is where land that was previously farmed is not farmed now. And while in some ways that can be a positive, it has chance to recover. Potentially there would be, it would revert to brush or woodland. But if that happens, you're losing those peatland habitats. And if it's within a designated SAC area, we should be maintaining the peatland habitats. So they require some level of grazing to prevent them getting scrubbed over. If the land becomes abandoned and it gets scrubbed over, then it becomes a concern for, like, it's a fuel load. So if there is a wildfire, you've got this huge area then where there's plenty of fuel for the fire to go crazy. And then we also have huge issues with invasive species kind of all over our uplands in most areas in Kerry. We have rhododendron is probably one of the biggest issues on peatlands, because it can encroach into the peatland and it's going to completely change that habitat. So there's a lot of like complex things working around sort of social and environmental issues. It depends, I suppose, on your overall view. If the trees come back, the peatland is going to change. We're not going to have these blanket bogs that we have now. So you're talking about having a completely different habitat. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, from a cultural or an environmental perspective, there's sort of discussions on both sides. One of the key things for us at the moment is that we have to abide to the European directives, which are the Birds and Habitats directives. Those have seen the designation of areas of Kerry as special areas of conservation. And the qualifying interests for those areas is the peatland. And so we are incentivized by these directives to maintain those areas as peatland. And so if we allow them to revert to woodland now, we're going against the EU regulations that are in place. I know one of the biggest contributions of peat is that it sequesters so much carbon. It's not that it's drawing it in, it's that it's holding it already. And so if we're degrading our peatlands, we're increasing the amount of CO2 that it's going to emit. And so there might be changes there in, I don't know the mathematics of it, but there might be changes there in how well it can sequester carbon.
And that affects everything.
And it does, and I know if it reverts to woodland, there's a certain amount of time before you have established woodland that has its peak CO2 sequestration potential, and so you've got a transition period there where the numbers are maybe not going to be so great for us. Like as far as I know, the best thing we can do is keep the peat we have. I'm actually working on a project at the minute where we're looking at creating an invasive species swatch for Kerry. And there is a significant number of species on that. And that includes things from coastal species to freshwater to plants and invertebrates. In terms of our terrestrial plants, in Kerry, I would say rhododendron and Japanese knotweed are probably the two most prolific and the most concerning. We also have community groups at the moment who are working on trying to remove Mombretia from their hedgerows. And I have been asked questions about whether we should be concerned with removing fuchsia, which most people would consider as naturalized. So the invasive species is it's a huge concern. At the moment, nationally, we don't have a cohesive strategy for approaching the management of these. Many groups, like there's a group in Dunquin, have successfully eradicated Japanese knotweed from their catchment area, which is fantastic. But there are huge issues along many of our rivers and streams with Japanese knotweed. Because that's a plant that dies back over winter, it essentially will take over the riverbank, creating a monoculture. It dies back over winter, and now the riverbank is bare and exposed to the weather. And so when we're seeing these bigger rain events and the floods, it's ripping out sections of, it's changing the water courses, essentially. Like they would be more stable if they had a suite of native plants there that would maintain a ground structure over winter. Rhododendron has become so prolific. There's an example that I was told from the Reeks EIP project that they mapped one farmer's land in the McGillicuddy Reeks and they had 100 acres of rhododendron. So when rhododendron takes over an area, it's quite a large sort of tree-like bush. It shades out everything underneath it, so you have zero undergrowth. Studies have shown the number of invertebrates associated with it is significantly lower than those would be associated with a suite of native plants. And so you're seeing a completely changed landscape if you have a rhododendron infestation, particularly an aged rhododendron infestation. Like you'll be walking through a dark forest with just the bare branches of rhododendron, its green leaves on top, and then just fallen rhododendron leaves underneath you and not really much else with the opportunity to grow, which is completely different to if you walk through a healthy native woodland, for example. You'll see different layers of vegetation, you'll see mosses and lichens, you'll see insects and birds. So it really does have the potential to completely change the landscape and the habitats when it takes over. There is. I was involved in a project a few years ago now in Caherdaniel where we looked at the potential for that. And that was really driven by concern within the local community of using a glyphosate-containing herbicide as the treatment method. So we were looking for more natural methods of treatment. Some ideas were around goat grazing or cattle grazing. And one of them was around harvesting, because there is, I think it's resveratrol that's in it that can be used for a medication. I think part of the issue, are we then going to encourage people to grow more of it, thus impacting more of our natural habitats? And then there is issues around the economy of, or the longevity of a business built on the concept of eradicating a plant from an area, in that, yeah, how does it work longer term? If your hope is to eradicate the plant, how does that fit into a model where you're harvesting, if that makes sense? I think there is potential there, but I I don't know of any projects that have successfully sort of navigated through how to actively manage knotweed and have some kind of economic benefit from it. We're also very restricted, and I think rightly so, by the invasive species legislation. So it is one of the it's one of the restricted species, and so you can't legally grow it or transport it or knowingly spread it. So there's issues there around you be coming up against the legislation if you were trying to harvest and transport it. I would say probably invasive species is one of the top ones. I would also say that land use change. So we see obviously there's a lot of development required. We are in the middle of a housing crisis, but alongside of that, we do need to balance the habitats that we're moving into, or the natural spaces we're taking over. So I think land use change is a big concern. And that is not just sort of development, but it would be agriculture as well that would impact on that. Climate change, of course, is a huge concern, and I think it's probably one of the most worrying ones, because no one really has the answers. Like we have projections, we have assumptions, but we don't have information on how do we manage this. And so going forward, we're seeing changes, and we essentially don't have any studies or evidence-based case studies to show us how to manage certain situations, because we're saying this, our sand dunes could be eroding more because of climate change. What do we do about that? Short of stop climate change, what's the practical solution on the ground for managing habitat loss in an area that is caused by climate change? And then around the kind of overlaps with the invasive species query as well, as we're seeing changes in the range of certain species because of changing temperatures, and it's particularly prevalent in the marine environment. There's a lot of unknowns around that area as well. So I think those are kind of the three key things nationally that come up a lot in discussion on the issues that we're facing. I'm gonna put a caveat to this and say I am not an ecologist. So from my somewhat limited knowledge on terrestrial plants, I would say if we lost like the sphagnum mosses in the bog, those are the bog builders. So if we lose them, that's our peatlands in big trouble. We're experiencing serious issues all over Ireland with ash dieback disease. They would be a real keystone species for a lot of our native woodland. Similarly, like any of our native trees, like oak, if you lost oak trees, you're losing not just our natural heritage, but our cultural heritage as well. I suppose it's things like the bluebells in the woodland. Every May, summer's coming because the bluebells are erupting out of the earth all over the place. Yeah, I would say the gorse as well, but some of our gorse, I think there's two species of gorse, and one of them is non-native and one of them is native. So probably attributing my memories to the non-native one, that's probably not the best, but it does serve a purpose, and that's that lovely coconutty smell. I think as well I suppose I grew up on a farm, so you're kind of around sort of semi-natural grassland areas, so you couldn't, well, I certainly couldn't point my finger at one plant, but there's a smell when you walk through a a field of grass that's growing and healthy, and has some grazers in it like cattle or sheep, and yeah, that kind of outdoorsy smell where you're outside. Yeah.
Does clover, or does that resonate?
It could be the clover. Yeah, it could be the clover. Absolutely. So my house is overlooking Kenmare Bay, where I grew up. And you could open the window on a rough day, you could hear the waves from the house, and sometimes you can hear the waves from the other side of the peninsula from our house, and we know the weather's really bad then. But that kind of like saltiness in the air is definitely something that you kind of you're nearly home kind of a thing when you're. So I suppose I lived away for a while, so you get back on the plane, you get in the car, you drive, and you open the window, and suddenly you're smelling the sea, and you're nearly there, which I suppose is that kind of sentiment of being home. There is the other side of that, and that in the summertime, when you get a big wash up of seaweed and a few hot days, you get a really pungent smell that I don't think many people would enjoy. But yeah, there is something about the scent of the beach, and yeah, the seaweed there, and definitely a lot of our communities around definitely the peninsula here, and up around Dingle and the Maharees have a really strong tradition in rowing. So there'd be rowing coastal boats, and these would have traditionally been the fishing boats. And so I suppose a lot of my memories, my childhood memories anyway, of that would be the scent of the sea. Would be you're out on the water, you're rowing, your body's screaming at you, you think you're in hell, and then you stop for a break and you're like, oh, it smells lovely out here, and it's so relaxing, and the boat's just bobbing on the waves, and it's really lovely. And I think a lot of people growing up would have participated in rowing at some point, so that would be a real link there. So on my farm, we had the traditional old stone house there, which had that huge, big traditional old fireplace. It had like the two, they looked like stone seats at the side of it, and the big metal bar that you hung the pot on. And my dad would feed pigs when we were younger, and he would have the potatoes that we couldn't eat, say if you stabbed them with the pike, or they had a hole in or whatever, we'd chop those up and boil them up for the pigs. And we'd use the fire in the old house. We had this big old urn thing that would hang on the big metal arm coming out, and boil the potatoes for the pigs. And so that would have been traditionally a turf fire. And so that kind of smell, it almost like permeated the whole house. And then when we moved into our newer build, we had a range, and that would have been burning turf. And so you'd come in, you'd smell the turf. You can smell it as you're like driving up the road. You can smell the smoke out of the chimney. The fire's on. When you come in, it's going to be nice and warm. So there is that kind of like comfort aspect to it. My mom always said that I think it was when she was pregnant with my older sister, that she would have been in and out of the old house where the big old fire was. And so she associated the smell of turf with her pregnancy. And then for years afterwards, when she'd smell turf, I'd feel nauseous, because it was just at that point in the pregnancy when I was feeling nauseous. And so she had more of a negative association with the smell of turf. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think every family in Ireland would have had a turf fire. Like, it was our main fuel source. It's I think probably only now that you're seeing a generation growing up without a turf fire. Most of my friends thought it was hilarious that I had never been to the bog to cut turf, because we don't have a bog out in Carradaniel. And so a lot of my friends are from Drummond, and they would regularly every summer get dragged by their parents out to the bog to help with cutting the turf and turning it and stacking it or whatever they're doing. But I have never spent a day on the bog, and they'd be like, oh, you have to, you get a great tan out there and everything. So yeah, there is a whole sort of cultural thing around turf. It's the burning of it, it's the making of it, it's the transport of it, and that kind of thing as well, that is kind of part of our culture, really. That is a really hard question to answer. I don't know. Like, I suppose aspirationally, I'd hope to see something like the scent of the sea, or, the scent of a healthy peat bog. But most of us don't have access to places like that. A lot of us live a life that's kind of disconnected from areas of land. So short of being able to go for hikes on waymarked trails, would you have access to a bogland if your family weren't cutting turf there? I don't know. Would you go if you didn't have to go and cut the turf? I don't know. And then looking forward, I suppose we're looking at transitions to renewable energy. They're kind of low emissions things, so they're not going to come along with a scent, or at least I'm not aware of a scent they're going to come along with. So yeah, it's interesting to think about what potentially could emerge. Like, maybe it's we all start growing local produce, and it's the smell of the earth that you're turning to plant the spuds in spring or something. Maybe, I don't know. Something like that would be cool, but I don't know how you would put a finger on it. I think in Ireland, one thing, I suppose, maybe I am biased in this because I studied marine biology and I worked in marine awareness and education for a while, and I did find it to be really meaningful work. But something that really struck me was how disconnected a lot of our community had become from the sea, even though we are an island nation. And so potentially that scent of seaweed, the scent of the beach, the scent of the ocean, it would be great to see that as the smell that identifies us going forward. Because I do think there's a lot of potential for us in our marine habitats and our marine territory. We have, I think it's 10 times the size of the land, our marine territory. So there is a huge amount of potential there going forward. Traditionally, all of our coastal communities would have been fishing communities, and that's kind of died away a little bit for various reasons, but it would be great to see more support for local fisheries. And then other users now, like recreational users, water sports, divers, that kind of thing. Definitely with Kerry, we're essentially two peninsulas pointing out into the ocean. You're surrounded on three sides by water in most of Kerry, so I think that would be a really significant scent for most people here. I think there is a lot of potential within our education system to center around nature as a theme, rather than saying have maths and English and Irish and ecology or biodiversity or whatever as a topic. Embed our natural heritage through all of the subjects that we're doing. And I think that then kind of it builds a better understanding for the systems that we live in, how we impact them, and how we can have a positive impact on them, I suppose. And I think that's one of the issues that I certainly was aware of when I worked with Sea Synergy doing their education programs. It's something that has been said to me by other educators, by teachers at secondary level, and by lecturers at third level, that there is such a focus on having these really strict curriculum that we don't have the opportunity to bring nature into the classroom. But if you speak to someone who works in outdoor education, they will say that nature is the classroom. And so how can we, like going forward as a nation, start to encourage that, in that it's, instead of saying, well, I don't want to pick on any particular career, but you're going to be a plumber or an electrician, or you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever you're going to be. Throughout your education, you still have this kind of inbuilt understanding of how our environment works. Because I think that's the key piece that's missing for most people, is that they're doing their best within their sort of bubble that they live in and they work in. But they never had the opportunity to really create that connection growing up. And we can't just say, oh, well, everyone has to be connected to nature, and so you should pursue an environmental career, because we need all of the careers that we have, you know? So it's trying to identify a way that it brings it into people's experience so that they can carry that forward with them, rather than trying to have just like a one segregated approach. And so, like, some of the work I've done some in-house training with staff in the council. It was really relevant for particular departments. People from those departments came, but it was also open to other departments. And there were people from other departments that are interested in learning. You know, I think the appetite is there, but I also think we have to make it easy. Like, we have to make it accessible. We have to make it doable. If someone has a busy job, they've got kids at home, you know, they're trying to keep their house going, they've got a dog to walk, they've got dinner to, you know, they have the same stresses that we all do, and they're working in a completely different field. And so for me, it's easy to sit down and say, okay, well, this evening I'm going to read this book that's going to educate me on a new habitat, or I'm going to read this new report that's come out from the EPA, because it's tied into my work. And so I have an incentive to put the time in. And so in a way, I feel like there's more payback for me professionally in taking those actions. Whereas if you're someone who works in a completely different sector, what's like, how do you, where's the motivation for you to put that time aside to do it? Outside of course, it's good for all of us to know, but those reports are heavy reading. You know, they're not made accessible. The information isn't provided sometimes in a way that's easily digestible. And I think sometimes it's not so much about the facts and the figures, it's about the actions. It's how do we make the actions easy? Because we can talk all day about the numbers, but at the end of the day, if people are not going to stop boiling the kettle 10 times, or they're not going to convert their house to solar, or, you know, there's so many things that we can do. It's getting the information and the support there to help people make those changes. That's really what's needed, because it's hard when you're busy. Like I mentioned before, the housing crisis, cost of living is going up. Like, people have other stresses. It's very hard to focus outside of your day to day sometimes. And so how do we make it as easy for people to make these transitions, so that collectively we can have the impact that we need to have? I would say no. I couldn't direct you to a website right now that says, in County Kerry, this is what your garden should look like. Now, we have national policies like the All Ireland Pollinator Plan that will direct you towards pollinator-friendly species. It will tell you whether those are native or non-native. Sometimes they recommend non-native species for gardens just because people like to have more colour throughout the season, or for whatever reason. But they do have a focus on, say, native plants for hedgerows and things like that. So you can look at that website. They have a whole suite of booklets and posters and things that are downloadable that will have all that information in. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And they've written booklets specific to gardens, to golf courses to sports clubs to community groups to farmers. So whatever sort of area you're working in, there's something there that's tailored specifically to what your needs or wants might be. I think that's probably the best resource that we have. I don't think there's anywhere else that you could really go to for a sort of a set list, if that makes sense.